Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how the yuck is this person still alive? One of my prior patients is a roofer who lived a very full life of alcohol, women, and drugs. He was infected with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and was psychotic, and didn't really care about his health at all. He was ghostly thin, and weighed 110 pounds on a 6-foot frame, which included 20 pounds of ascites in his abdomen. He was angry, and didn't listen to anyone, refusing therapy most of the time. I met him first in the ICU, where he had full-blown AIDS, end-stage liver disease, hepatorenal syndrome, unexplained lymph nodes all over his body, variceal hemorrhage, Kaposi's sarcoma, and spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Prognosis of in-hospital death was greater than 90% even with therapy. I was involved in his care for about 2 weeks and again he refused every therapy that his primary physician suggested. I was surprised he lasted the 2 weeks. Finally, he was so fed up of the noisiness in the ICU that he requested transfer to palliative care and was eventually sent to a hospice for patients with advanced HIV to live out his remaining few days. 1 year later I get a call from the hospice requesting a follow-up appointment for him. I was shocked that he was still alive and asked if I could talk to him. He was all better. Turns out he had the hots for his nurse in the hospice and did everything she asked in order to please her, including taking his medications for the first time. She had slowly nursed him back to health, convinced him to restart HIV meds, put him on a low salt diet for his liver disease, and then eventually got him up and mobile. He spent another 6 months in a rehabilitation facility, then went back to work. He saw me in follow-up for a while as we treated his hepatitis C, then his cirrhosis shockingly improved. After a couple of years he moved away to another place to start a construction company and became rather successful financially and remains abstinent on his form of vices. He's the only person that I've seen come back from death. To that stick out. Guy gets shot in the abdomen, drops to his knees, shooter puts one through the top of his head near his forehead. Bullet exits through his jaw. He wouldn't stop complaining about how much he hates that the guy who shot him. Young girl driving a car gets T-boned on the passenger side by an Altima going at least 70 miles per hour. Her car looks like it was hit by an IED, so we assumed she was deceased upon arrival when the other crew on scene said our focus was extricating the people in the Altima. Girl driving was completely unhurt by a Volvo. Kind of a retelling. But, one time a cadaver on which I was performing an autopsy had a lung which was flipped upside down. When I tried to flip it to the proper position, bloop, it flipped right back to upside down. After some due diligence we realized the lung was a transplant, and the surgeons who performed the transplant had attached the organ incorrectly. The lung had been fighting to be upside down its whole life in this other man. After 15 or so years, the man eventually moved in a way that allowed it to flip over, resulting in his death. Not really a how the yuck is this person still alive, but more of a how the yuck did this person live this long with this condition. Older woman called 911 for chest pain. Her vital signs were it, and she had the look that anyone who's ever seen a patient about to die will recognize instantly. Her EKG suggested multiple blockages in her coronary arteries, and we had to put her on a ventilator shortly after she got to the ER because she deteriorated so quickly. Cath lab confirmed the EKG findings, complete blockage of one artery and 99% blockage of 2 other major arteries. Unfortunately it was too extensive to resolve with PCI, so the only option was to fly her to the university hospital in the city for an emergent triple bypass. It turned out that she'd had multiple episodes like this, but not quite as severe, over the last 6 months, and had refused bypass surgery not once, not twice, but 3 times in favor of a Mediterranean diet. Well, at this point she didn't have much say anymore and family agreed, so off to the OR she went. I took care of her again about 4 months later, and she actually seemed to have made a remarkable recovery. As a student had a young guy come in who self-inflicted a 22 to the inside of his mouth and passed out. Awoke the next morning, didn't recall the night prior, went to work. 2 hours into work he says he's not feeling right and starts acting odd. Co-workers call EMS, they take him in, and the ED is working him up, and in the process notices a mix of clear fluid and blood in the back of his mouth. They call ENT and get a CT head. Shows 11 or so bullet fragments throughout his noggin. The guy was acting by that time completely unfazed. I was very fazed. I helped take care of an old dude who had one leg amputated and had broken his other leg, so he was seeing us because of that. He was on oxygen and not being very compliant with using his wheelchair. We were talking with him and he was getting really argumentative. How am I supposed to chop wood in a wheelchair? Was what he kept demanding. When asked how he was chopping wood with one leg in the first place, he responded that he'd crawl into the woods and hop up to chop the wood. This was even more concerning. When the doctor asked how he was carrying his axe, oxygen, and the wood he chopped, he looked him straight in the eye and said, "I carry him on my back." Not sure if he was serious, but he was pretty dang grizzled and looked like he may have been crawling through the woods. I'm still fairly new in my training, but one of the first crazy recoveries I've seen. College kid was out drinking with his buddies and had a bit too much to drink. He presumably aspirates some of his vomit and it causes this massive inflammatory reaction in his lungs called ARDS. He goes from perfectly healthy to being on death's door within an hour. He gets transferred to our ICU in the middle of the night, completely unstable, on a ventilator, maximumed out on 5 presses, life support meds to keep your blood pressure up, and is being considered for re-CMO. Edit. Basically like a temporary machine bypass of your heart and lungs, used as a last-ditch effort to save someone. His parents are on a last-minute flight from out of state with no bags packed to get to their son. Our team is concerned that he won't make it through the night and braces friends for the worst. The treatment for ARDS is actually something called pronouncing, which is when you literally just flip the patient onto their stomach. And miraculously, 2 hours later he is off all presses, maintaining his own blood pressure, and while very sedated from all the meds he's able to respond to voice and shake and nod his head to questions. He makes a full recovery 4 days later, and vowing to stay away from alcohol for a while. Both of the stories I'm sharing occurred during the Nepal earthquake of 2015. First was an infant who had a roof fall on his head. He was trapped for 10 minutes before being rescued, and took another 3 hours to drive him to the nearest functioning hospital. This happened in a remote area, and he was brought in a taxi. His face was so swollen that it was probably more than double its original size. The top of his head was completely flat, like a dinner plate, and he had raccoon eyes. But somehow he was showing no danger signs and his vitals were normal. A CT scan miraculously showed that there was no brain damage or even an actual fracture. He had something called a ping pong fracture. The child recovered pretty well and was discharged in a couple of days. Second was a lady who was roughly 8 months pregnant. Again, the roof of her house fell on her, sadly on her belly. From what she said, she was stuck under the rubble for about 4 hours, and it took a further 2 to 3 days to airlift her to the hospital. An X-ray of the pelvis was done which showed that it was broken badly in at least 4 places. But miraculously enough, there was very minimal bleeding. Someone with pelvis fracture can bleed to death easily, and she had multiple fractures in her pelvis. Nobody can say what happened for sure, but it was thought that probably the weight of the rubble was so strong that it actually helped stop the bleeding due to the applied pressure. More miraculously enough, the baby showed no signs of injury or even stress, even though the roof fell straight on her belly and was delivered healthily via C-section. You know those big 16 to 18-inch kitchen knives that everyone has? Had a lady come in with one sticking sideways out of her neck, handle on the left side and top sticking out the right. She went to OR, where they removed the knife in one of the most tense asshole clenched moments in history. Minimal bleeding. Apparently the knife split right between her major blood vessels and airway. Was lying right against them. Didn't scratch him. Absolutely incredible. Infantry guy in Afghanistan in 2009. Some old guy came up to us in a bazaar and asked us to give him a ride to a city. His arm was wrapped up. We said no, since we don't exactly do that. He unwrapped his arm. His hand/wrist was missing, and his 2 arm bones were exposed and white. Everything else was green and black. I have no idea how he was alive, much less up and walking around. I'm not a doctor, but I was diagnosed with a dysentery at age 13 or so. Was just generally feeling lethargic, vomiting, dizzy. Mom calls the hospital with symptoms, and they said if I had all 3 at the same time, to come in to be safe. Orderly or whatever checks my pulse in the lobby. 30/15. He laughs, well this one's broken, and gets another machine. 30/15. Wait. What? Calls a doctor. They double check it and run me to the ER for fluids. Again, not a doctor here, but apparently that's not even high enough to have a pulse. They had no clue how I was walking, let alone conscious, but saw the numbers, and after realizing it was accurate they freaked the hell out. And of course that freaked my mom out. Them telling my mom 30/15 is the BP of a dead person did not help. And then they said it's either autoimmune or cancer. My immune system apparently ate my adrenal glands. Now I'm on meds for life. Lucky me. On the bright side though, I never really have to worry about high blood pressure.